Let's come to the 13th and last presentation in this series. We have been building resonances that collect and now constitute, with this presentation, as a harmonic. The 13 as a harmonic is interesting because we do it in a Sabbath cycle. We come together once every 7 days. And the seventh day for us is Saturday, which is the true Sabbath. And Saturday morning, we present in a cycle of resonances insights that are expressed so that they go back through, transforming an arrangement of phases. And the ancient way to speak of that arrangement of phases is thought, word, and deed. Thought being the symbolic structure of the mind. Word being the oral use of language so that the images and feelings of that oral language are able to express the character of experience. Deed, the rituals. Not only the rituals of what we do in selected, limited, formed vignettes, but the materia that we use, the existential things of the world, and our bodies, and the movements of our bodies, and the arrangement numerically of the existential things and the ritual actions and the way in which our comportment then blossoms in the language, in the word, and integrates in the thought, in the symbolic patterns. If one goes back through from the other way, those build up in an integral. If one goes back through with an extra dimension, the dimension of vision, thought transforms itself by acquiring something that pairs itself with the imagination, and that is the memory. And now it is as important to have a mnemonic structure as it is having an imaginative base. And because the feelings are allied with the images, the feeling tones now tune themselves. And when they tune themselves, they rearrange the way in which emotions are triggered in the ritual comportments, in the things, the phenomenon of the world, in the body, in the actions, in the ritual activities. And so the transform goes all the way back through, but does not stop with existence, does not stop with the ritual comportment, does not stop with the body. It penetrates back through the body, back through the rituals, to the field of nature herself. And when the field of nature is reapproached in that way, the field of nature has a mysterious quality to it. That mysterious quality is that existence springs spontaneously from that field. Particles come into being. Particles unify into atomic structures. Atomic structures unify into molecular structures, and they into biochemicals and life. And all of this then, the word that I use for it is recalibrated. Nature still works, but nature works with an added dimension, and what comes into play then spontaneously is that we now have what used to be called a magic realm. The word magic is from magi, which is an ancient world term originating in Central Asia, north of present-day Iran, in what is Uzbekistan. The Magi were the preservers of this kind of field of consciousness that could go back through thought, word, and deed and touch primordial nature again. So that the two fields of consciousness and nature married. They wed. They were able then to give a fifth dimension to space-time by rearranging space-time into time-space with a conscious triggering. So instead of space-time as a four-dimensional limited cycle, one now had a spiraling of that cycle, not as space-time, but as conscious time-space. A fifth dimension, a five-dimensional matrix. And out of that spiraling came something that was able naturally in its magical transform to move through the field of consciousness and do what nature had done, spontaneously rebirth a new form, and that was the spirit person. That the spirit person is literally born, just like out of nature one is existentially born, now one is spiritually born out of conscious time-space. And that person had a different kind of form instead of being limited to a pragmatic line of causality, of karma. One had a prismatic availability of a spectrum of possibilities, and the earliest way in which men and women talked about this some 5,000 years ago was that this was the rainbow covenant. It's important for us to recognize and understand that in our time, form, we are in a very strong threshold of very powerful harmonics. And what we're presenting here is an insight into the triggering some 4,000 years ago of a particular pair who tuned the way in which this was first brought into our planetary heritage. And those two figures, one was Jewish, the other was Iranian. So when we face the biggest travail of the early 21st century as a nuclear war possibility between Israel and Iran, it is paradoxical, it is not accidental, and is only resolvable by retuning and by reestablishing a way of recalibrating. And that is what we're doing here. In my translation of the Gathas of Zarathustra, which were written when he was 75, he was born about the same time that Abraham was born. They were both born about 2000 BC. When Zarathustra was 75, in 1925 BC, he wrote the Gathas near the end of his life. And Abraham received the promise and invitation to go to a promised land, to leave northern Mesopotamia, where he was, and to go in search of the promised land to the west. And so at the time that Zarathustra was writing the Gathas. Abraham was taking his wife, who was a paternal sister. They had different mothers, same father. And his nephew Lot and his wife and their animals and their servants and their households, and they went in search of the promised land that became Israel. Zarathustra did not write his Gathas in his homeland, which was up around where Samarkand is in Uzbekistan. He had been through a whole cycle over 75 years. And he wrote the Gathas in the final place that he settled. And that place today is the city of Kabul in Afghanistan. And it is in Kabul of Afghanistan that the Gathas are made. And some 225 years later, 250 years later, the descendants of the Zarathustrian vision had begun filtering through the Khyber Pass into northern India, that is today Pakistan, and that whole part of northern Pakistan, northern India, by about 1700 BC, about 225 years after Zarathustra, collected together poetic visions into the Rig Veda. And so the Rig Veda, the origin of Sanskrit language, is akin to the Avestan language of Zarathustra. In Zarathustra, the word is mantra. In Sanskrit, it's mantra. The theta of the original Avestan becomes the tra of the Sanskrit. And just in the way in which the Vedas came to be, over several hundred years, three of the Vedas were seen as being related together. The Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Sama Veda. And they were called the Trividya, the triad of visionary forms prismatically by which man could come to understand his thought, word, and deed in spirit transform modes. If one looks at the Rig Veda, which is arranged in 10 books, somewhat just over 1,000 hymns, each of the 10 books begins with poetic hymns to Agni, the sacred fire. Because in Zarathustra, it is the sacred fire that is the pivot, the central pivot by which all else is lighted up. That trigger pilot light of the center lights up a pair of triads on either side, and one gets a primordial menorah that has 7 candles, but that the middle candle has 2 wicks. Because in Zarathustra, in Zoroastrianism, the paired, tuned double wick of the middle is Ahura Mazda. Ahura originally is the Lord of Life, masculine. Mazda is the splendor of the radiance, feminine. So that the original menorah, while it looks like 7, is really 8. It's an ogdode. It's an octet. It's an octave. And to get the true harmonic, one must know that one is composing spiritually with an octave, though it is heard by the many as a 7-part, a septemtet. So one has to always be sure that one puts the extra into the 7, and usually what that is done is by an aspirant, by a making of a breath that is not sounded but is nevertheless there, pacing the pronunciation, the sounding, so that one says in ancient Hebrew, Hashem, Hashem. One puts an aspirant in, and very often words in the Greek will have the aspirant without being pronounced at the beginning of a spiritual word, so that instead of an H-E, whatever, you begin with the E, but aspirate it. So that in ancient languages that all come from the Indo-European family, one finds this kind of quality. Whereas in Chinese, in Japanese, in the Far Eastern languages, it is the pitch of the tone that gives the aspiration. For instance, the Chinese word for business is mai. Mai with a rising tone is buy, with a falling tone is sell. Business is buy, sell. This quality of seeing that there is a shared presence tuning at the pivot that lights up a pair of triads gives one a very interesting kind of outlook when it comes, say, to an octave in the Far East, like the I Ching, the 8 trigrams, the 8 bagua. There are a pair of 3 sets of the 8 trigrams and going up from the bottom, aspirantly rising. One is the yang line of the eldest son, the middle son, the youngest son. On the other, the eldest daughter, the middle daughter, the youngest daughter. At the top, on one, will be the father, pure yang, and the mother on the other being pure yin. But the yin yang are both proportions of the te. What is not put into the bagua is the Tao, because the Tao is the aspiration of the entire ecology of the 8 together. So that one has a very interesting thing. When it comes to the 5-phase Taoist energy cycle, it always begins with Tao and has not only its integral integrity, but has its differential creativity if the 5th phase is able to spiral back into the Tao and re-emerge fresh. And that 5th phase is the key, the chi, the energy, going through the thought, the word, and the deed back to primordial nature. And in this way, we come to understand that there is a huge heritage on the planet by our time of being able to appreciate now the scalar of civilization going back about 6,000 years. And in that scalar, the largest workable time form is the 2,000-year period called in Greek in ancient times an aeon, which is a tuned pair of millennia, and each millennia is a tuned pair of a cycle of the phoenix, and each cycle of the phoenix is 5 centuries, each century having 10 decades, and so on. And one sees that there is a numerical structure to this that was brought together most conscientiously about 500 BC. And in 500 BC, everywhere that one looks in the civilized heritage of the planet, there were major spiritual teachers. In China, you had Lao Tzu and Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu. In India, you had the historical Buddha. In Mesopotamia, you had, in the Jewish exile, Ezekiel. And the Greco-Roman world, Greco-Egyptian world initially, you had Pythagoras. You had all of those figures at the same time. And so about 500 years before you had the threshold of the close of an aeon and the beginning of a new aeon, the close of a millennium and the beginning of a new millennium, the close of a cycle of the phoenix and the beginning of a new cycle of phoenix, all of these targets of time forms came together about the time of Jesus. The most poignant quality that came through at that time was that though Lao Tzu and Confucius, the historical Buddha, Pythagoras, are all contemporaries, the fifth figure, Zarathustra, did not live then. He lived 1,500 years before then, but he had a great renaissance. He had a great revival and came back not as Zarathustra, but as Zoroaster. And Zoroaster does not mean the same thing that Zarathustra means. In ancient Avestan, one pronounces it Zarathustra, which means he who is really good with camels. Meaning that he ran successful caravan routes. Zoroaster means stargazer. He who is able to, in an accumulated penetration vision, see the stars in their patternings. It's not astrology, it's deeper than astrology. Astrology is about just the stars on the plane of the ecliptic. Zoroaster's stargazer cosmos with all of the stars in all of their patterns, and the classic way to express it is that if you took all the constellations of stars from the entire planet, you would come out with 88 constellations. Which is interesting because in an esoteric linguistic mystery, the Japanese word for rice has a radical character in it of 88, meaning this grain of rice comes to you through 88 hands. You are a part of an ecology that makes life possible in this way. You participate then in that ecology, not patiently, but realistically. Don't be just tolerant of it, be participatory in the way in which this ecology works. And so the whole understanding of community then is not something which is political, but something that is spiritually, consciously natural. The translation of Zarathustra, as I have shown, has an interesting form. The original Gathas of Zarathustra, he who is good with camels, had 16 yasnas in them, arranged so that they were grouped together in 4 gathas. The first 7 gathas, yasnas made the first gatha. The next gatha had 4 yasnas, the third had 4 yasnas, and the fourth gatha had only 1 yasna. If you take the beginning and the end, one has 8 that come together in a form, a harmonic of 7 to 1. The middle 4 and 4 are another octave, but they are balanced in equanimity, but they have a very relationality between them we'll get to in a second. So the first 7 gathas and the 16th being the first 7 yasnas and the last yasna making 8, if you look at the Rig Veda, it has the mirror form. The first book of the Rig Veda is a presentation that encloses the entire vision. The next 7 books of the Rig Veda, books 2 through 8, are of the families of the sage traditions in ancient India, who are the poet seers. They're the Rig masters. They're able to style the language so that when you hear the language of the Rig Veda chanted, and it is in a chant song mode that is absolutely primordial. I'll talk about that in a minute. It awakens your thought, word, and deed back to the primordiality of nature in its mystery, but with the conscious presence that goes into the presenting of nature, so that instead of getting a present phenomenal time moment, then as your existence comes back into play, it has what is called the breath of the eternal blessing it. This is a very remarkable spiritual expression. The term breath of the eternal was used when Prabhupada and Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood were doing their translations of the Upanishads. The 9th book of the Rig Veda is all about Agni. It's all about the Agni ceremony with the Soma. The Soma is the divine drink that is able to bring gods and man together in a ceremonial way so that they interpenetrate each other. Men learn the divine insight of the gods, and the gods learn the great humanity of humility of men. And both together then are able, through the Soma ceremonies of Agni, in order to carry this through. So important is it that the second Veda to come into play, the Yajur Veda, which comes in 2 forms, the white Yajur Veda and the black Yajur Veda. And the Yajur Veda is all about the way in which Agni can come into the presence of a ceremony that is especially laid out to invite that presence to come. And when that presence of Agni comes in the ceremony to the altar, the population that is there gain the resonance of the spirituality of Agni, of the sacred fire. And one is able to spontaneously, without having to really think about it, without having to be careful of how you talk about it, without having to be over meticulous of how you do it, because it is all presented in such a way that it is like a cup that is open to the presence coming into it. So that when one drinks the Soma together, this spiritual inebriation carries through gods and men and an unlimited resonance. About 30-some years ago, 40 years ago it started, there was a project to make a detailed film of the classic Yajurveda Agni ceremony. And it was largely funded by the University of California in the United States and by European scholars and by those in India. And 2 great, huge volumes were published by the University of California Press. And I have a set. And the Agni Chants were put out in 2 audio cassettes. And because I don't own the copyright, I will make a copy of the first of the audio tapes for those who get the notes to the Shared Presence series. When you hear the tape of the ancient Yajurveda Agni ceremony being chanted, it sounds for all the world like the chants of North American Indians at a powwow, doing their chanting, because the Northern American Indians come from an ancient Asian bloodline, an ancient Asian DNA heritage, and physiologically and in their blood type and in their psychic spontaneity of a conscious rebirthing in nature are enormously similar. One can't count the times that when the Tibetan Lamas have gone to relatives of the North American Indians, like the Navajo, or in their area, the Hopi, their ceremonies are very similar. They get each other. What is peculiar is that if you go back into the ancient ceremonies of the Celts, one finds the same thing. In 1911, a young American genius named W.Y. Evans Wentz went to Ireland, and his researches into Irish mythology and folklore was the fairy faith in Celtic countries. I'll bring a first edition from 1911 next week. He then found that the ancient Celtic symbols, ceremonies, understandings, when you put the conscious dimension into thought, word, and deed, were extremely parallel to those in Tibet. And so he went off to Tibet and for many, many years studied under a Lama, Lama Kazi Dawa Samdup, and wrote 4 classic books on Tibetan Buddhism, published by Oxford University Press, big green volumes. I bring the first editions of those as well next week. The first is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, then the Book of the Great Liberation, the Life of Milarepa, and these 4 books by Evans Wentz showed not only do the North American Indians resonate to the Tibetans, to the Chinese, to the Japanese, to the North American Indians, but that the whole planet has a heritage that's in tune and recoverable. Now that we're in the 21st century, we can recover it in quite an easy way. We can recalibrate ourselves to have the originality of the transform of thought, word, and deed. And that's what my learning civilization, spiraling, cycling ecology is all about. It's the representation of the ancient octave with the aspirant ninth so that it can be reinstated from scratch, no matter where you start. The translation of the 46th yasna of Zarathustra reads in this way in its first hat. And one has to understand the first 7 yasnas as a group have 6 lines each. The next 4 yasnas, making the second gatha, have 5 lines each. The third gatha, the next 4 yasnas, have 4 lines each. 6, 5, 4. And when you get to the last yasna, the 16th, the 4th of the Gathas, there are only 3 lines each. 6, 5, 4, 3. But if you look at the first Gatha, it has 6 lines in 11 poems or hats. The 16th has 3 lines in 22 poems or hats. So that if you pair the 16th so that you get 3 and 3 tuned together, you get a beautiful presentation of the 6 lines again recovered. Here's how the 46th yasna begins. This is about 1900 BC. To which land should I turn? Where should I go? Remember, this is contemporary with Abraham receiving the promise to go to the promised land. For the man of light there is only the noble friends. Never has my enlightening been with men of action, nor in any country where are rulers of deceit. How then does one, Mazda, enlighten with Ahura? The noble friends re-emerge 3,000 years later in Basra, of what is today Iraq, 1,000 years ago. And they were called the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity. And in the only English book on them, Muslim Neoplatonists, An Introduction to the Thought of the Brethren of Purity by Ian Richard Netton, published in 1982, you see 3 Sufi saints because the archetype is the 3 wise men together, because the archetype that comes 1,000 years earlier are the 3 magi that come to witness and seal the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. Not only to seal it, but to bring 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gold is from Ethiopia. The frankincense and myrrh is from southern Arabia, what is today Yemen. How do 3 Iranian magi come through southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa up into Jerusalem? They come by a trade route that was owned by the family of Philo of Alexandria, that went not only to the Horn of Africa and southern Arabia, but all the way across the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, to India. That's how the Apostle Thomas got from Jerusalem to India, is by that family trade route. We're going to talk some more as soon as we take a little break. Let's come back. We're looking at the floor plan of the burial spot of the patriarchs in Hebron. The spot is called the Cave of Machpelah. And if one goes to the Encyclopedia Judaica, in 16 volumes, one reads that the Cave of Machpelah, Machpelah means the cave of the double or the couple. So that not only is Abraham buried here, but his wife Sarah is buried here as well. And not only is their son Isaac buried here, but Rebekah, his wife, is buried here as well. Not only is Jacob buried here, but his first wife Leah is buried here. Shared presence, pairs, collected together. And in this case, there are not only 2 and 2 and 2, but there's a 7th, which is Joseph. Joseph is the son of Jacob. He is the grandson of Isaac. He is the great-grandson of Abraham. Now, it's extremely important because Hebron was not always called Hebron. In ancient times, it was called Kiriath Arda, which means the town of the four. The four is a quaternary. It's a square. It's also a frame of reference. It's what I call in my learning civilization education a square of attention. It's how to compose your symbolic structure so that you have a way of seeing, and if you are prismatic, you can move that frame of reference around so that you have a chance to have a multiple angle of vision. For instance, the two eyes will focus, they will integral perception to a point. You can see the dot. If you rotate that frame of reference, that square of attention, 360 degrees, the dot will make a ambit that is now a circumference. That is a circle, which is the plane, the equatorial plane of how you stand up in the world. Your existence, your extant. But your standing up in the world can also be a standing forth from the world, an ecstasy. So that not only can you have an angle of vision that can be rotated 360 degrees, but can be shown the entire sphere. Now, instead of having a square of attention, you have a prismatic sphere, a sphericality. The way to talk about distance in the sphericality is not by a linear distance, but by an amplitude. That amplitude is expressible in terms of energy. The frequency of the energy in its primordial field will be a dynamic, like a thermodynamics. But when it is polarized into electromagnetism, the amplitude, the frequency will not be a dynamic, it will be an energy. And the energy, because it is an integral, will have an exact registry. One will be able to tell to any amount of exactness exactly what that frequency is, what that energy is. So instead of looking at a star, one can look at starlight. Instead of having an astronomy, one now has an astrophysics. You can take a heliospectrograph of any star, and it will have not only a registry of all of the elements that are there in that astrophysical starlight, but it will also have dark lines. They're called Fraunhofer lines, from the man who first found them a couple of hundred years ago. Those Fraunhofer lines and the other registry lines will tell you through that starlight the entire amplitude of the whole cycle of existence of that star. We have instrumentation now that can calibrate millions of stars at once. We live in a time where you cannot be satisfied with an education that is merely integral, is only pragmatic, only pays attention to thought, word, and deed. That has not been sufficient for an enormous amount of time, for an incredible planetary heritage of space, for a permanent intergalactic range of eternal consciousness. We can no longer be animals hoping to be men. We must be spiritual persons expecting to live in reality. That's what all this is about. The cave of Machpelah in Hebron, in Old Kiryat Arda, is referred to as the cave of the sleepers of Abraham, of his family, because the initial visionary realization for him was that his wife, Sarah, died and he had to have a place, a special place to bury her, so that he could then, when his time came, to be buried with her. And because there was a promise, not only of a promised land, but of a heritage, of a lineage which would be an inheritance passed on through a synthesizing thread of descendants, one by one by one, the resonance of each of those descendants would accumulate to such an extent that when he was in, you can read this in Genesis, he was a friend of God. He was talked to as a special friend for whom a special covenant was going to be made. And the covenant was shown to him in a very graphic way. God, as a friend, took him by the hand and took him outside in the night sky and showed him the stars. Now, the prosaic understanding has always been he will have as many descendants as there are stars, a lot of them. The resonant understanding that has always been there is that he was shown that the amplitude of his heritage goes out into the heavens. It isn't the number of stars, is that all these worlds and more are in this inheritance. We live in the first generation who are physically able to take our existentiality off the planet into interplanetary space and soon into interstellar space and into intergalactic spaces nearly without end. What is interesting is that the position of Abraham as a pivot comes at a threshold of two immense time forms, because 2,000 years before Abraham was Adam, and 2,000 after him was Jesus. So that there's a double aeon between Adam and Jesus, pivoted by Abraham, who then becomes a significant figure because he passes the heritage of the stars are your true home in terms of your inheritance. because 2,000 years after Jesus, we come. So that Jesus is now a pivot between ourselves and Abraham, that double aeon. So that Abraham becomes an immense, significant double aeon figure for us, a person who is indeed a noble friend of God. This cave of Machpelah in Hebron is one of the fundamental locations that I have put into the expanded proposal for the New Jerusalem Planetary Park. To take out of the polarity of contention between Israel and Palestine, between Islam and Judaism, or even between Islam and more formidably Christianity, to take out of that polarity and to transform it into a complementarity. Because one can take electromagnetism and transform it into magnetoelectric energy. And when one does this, one enters the spiritual prismatic calibration of the cosmos. Here, the most familiar of all of the amplitude is the 96% of the cosmos that does not register as light. It registers, as we would say prosaically, as dark matter and dark energy. No matter how large the stars are, the spaces between them are much larger. No matter how large galaxies are, the spaces between them are much larger. And outside of whatever perimeter, moving perimeter there is of the universe, that as yet unintegrated, uncalibrated, pre-space, pre-time, is immense beyond conception of what the universe is currently. Our only reality is not to wake up simply, but to awaken our quality of learning to stay awake. Which means that instead of having an education as some kind of posited place that you do when you're young or revisit when you want to update, that it is a differential, conscious, prismatic, moving spectrum. It is an astrophysics of learning. It was a completely different scalar. Here is an exemplar. The only way to resolve the impasse of the current two-state solution, which cannot be affected, is to put visionary dimensions in to expand the amplitude of what is actually real. So my proposal for the New Jerusalem Planetary Park is to have it start at the place of the first visiting of the revisioning of the Promised Land, and that is the last place that Moses went to, Mount Nebo. Moses, who wrote Genesis and Exodus and the Torah, but was not allowed into the Promised Land, could see that it was true, but could only pass on then. There were only 2 men that survived the entire Exodus. One of them was named Caleb, the other was named Joshua. Joshua bar Nun. Joshua the son of Nun, who received from Moses the capacity to go into the promised land and bring everyone who had not just survived through the Exodus, but who had been born in 3 generations in that Exodus. Because it takes a 3-generational time form in terms of an integral to bring the fullness out. It's like letting good wine mature for 40-some years, and now we can serve that wine. It is ready. It is ready to be served. It is at its peak, at its pinnacle. We see this in terms of heritage. We mentioned this morning the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity in Basra 1,000 years ago. Chapter 4 of the book by Netten with the 3 magi on the cover. The Christian and Judaic substrate of Islam. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam may be all termed Abrahamic religions, for all 3 have a common ancestor in Abraham. So that in the New Jerusalem Planetary Park, one moves by taking Mount Nebo and its surrounding lands down the Wadi al-Qarar tributary to the Jordan River, not far from where the Dead Sea is, a couple of miles, about 4 or 5 miles from Qumran, up the road that goes up to Jerusalem. Greater Jerusalem, including the airport to the north, and Bethlehem to the south, and then a road running from Jerusalem down to Hebron on the ridge. So it's not the land, but just the royal road going from Bethlehem to Hebron, and going from Hebron down the great ridge through the Shephelah all the way to the coast at the Mediterranean Sea. And there at the coast would be a 4-square-mile seaport to be made. And I suggest the name Port Isaac for it. And that the road be large enough so that you not only have 3 lanes going each way, but that you have a median strip in between them of, say, about 8 lanes, which then will allow for that strip of land and those 3 lanes on both sides and a lane on both sides of that as spin-offs, that median be planted with trees that are of that area that are able to give fruit. Date palms, figs, olives. And that these trees and medicinal herbs and flowers and occasional food patches be a part of the New Jerusalem Planetary Park, to be overseen by Planetary Park rangers, not police, not military. And that when one comes from Port Isaac up to Hebron, that there be a way station there that is a part of the Planetary Park that includes the Cave of Machpelah and a couple of attendant mosques and a few other areas. The Jews and the Christians were not allowed to worship at the Cave of Machpelah for over 700 years, till the War of 1967, and now under Israeli control. By putting all of this into the Planetary Park, the New Jerusalem Planetary Park, one has a chance now to have all of the major sites of the 3 great religions that pivot out of Abraham and come into a play of a shared history of now over 4,000 years. And that road from Port Isaac up to Hebron be called the Isaac Way, and from Jerusalem over to Mount Nebo be called the Ishmael Way. And just as there is a port on the Mediterranean Sea for world shipping to come to the planetary park, down from Mount Nebo would be the Ishmael Spaceport. A spaceport is being made, a civilian spaceport, not the military spaceport at Edwards Air Force Base, not the military spaceports that are at Area 51 and in Utah, but the civilian commercial spaceport being built in New Mexico under Governor Bill Richardson's encouragement, that the Ishmael Spaceport then be available as on that site as the way in which the planetary park is able to take people out into space, not only to the space station, but to coming lunar bases and other space stations and other planetary destinations that the next generation are going to be able to indeed enjoy and take advantage of. This would be the New Jerusalem Planetary Park. But the road from Bethlehem to Hebron should be called the Way of the Magi. It is the way of which something that is there contemporaneous, not only with Islam, not only with Judaism, not only with what became Christianity, but there is a fourth. There is a missing part that is not there, and that is the ancient Zoroastrian trigger spark that was there originally tuned to Abraham. The three magi, if one comes to this old 1905 bound issue of the Journal of the American Oriental Society, 1905, the American Oriental Society was in New Haven, Connecticut, which is Yale University. On page 79 and following is an article by the great A.V. Williams Jackson. Jackson, A.V. stands for Abraham Valentine. Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson. One of his great books is Zoroaster, the Prophet of Ancient Iran. But in here, in this particular issue of the American Oriental Society Journal, the article is The Magi and Marco Polo and the Cities in Persia from which they came to worship the infant Christ. So it's the three magi who financed the Holy Family to be able to go to Egypt for what it turns out to be a 5-year sojourn to escape the infanticide of King Herod, who was decaying mentally and physically at that time, the slaughter of the innocents. It was 3 Iranians bringing 3 gifts from southern Arabia and from the Horn of Africa to finance the Holy Family to flee to Egypt, to be safe, and to return only after Herod died. Now, gold, frankincense, and myrrh are extremely valuable in small quantities. And while Joseph was a champion figure, Joseph means in the Greek translation of the name, it means the additional Lord, the Lord of the addition, the one who is able to master anything additional to just what has happened naturally. One has to have such a figure, such a person, such a spirit person, because the interference of the natural cycle builds up artificiality. The man-made pride and mistakes, which Philo of Alexandria brings out so beautifully in his life of Joseph, in his collected writings published by Harvard University Press in 12 volumes. When the accumulation of the gunk of man's artificiality suffocates nature in such a way that it is close to asphyxiating, a Lord of those problems must come in to resolve that. In Jesus' time, the problem was the Roman Empire, which built on a base of Hellenistic kingdoms coming together powerfully in someone like Alexander the Great, based on powerful tyrannies like ancient Egypt and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, etc., so that one had thousands of years of accumulation. That was bad enough. And so a Lord of resolving man's inhumanity to man in the natural cycle had to come in and clean it up. We live in a time 2,000 years later, an aeon later, where the jeopardy is much more severe than the Roman Empire, than the accumulation of the tyrannical traditions of thousands of years of empires upon which that was based. We not only have a planet which is suffocating, but we are faced with the challenge of interstellar civilizations that view man as a domestic herd to be harvested unless they can mature. So our challenge is one not of a Roman Empire, but on a galactic range of threat. And so our response must be in a kind and a scalar that is able to bring this into play, which we can do. And actually, it doesn't take that long. By the way, I will put a copy of this short article by Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson into the notes for the shared presence. The edition of Marco Polo that he used is the big, it's not just a 2-volume, it's a 3-volume by Colonel Ewell. And you can find in Dover reprints the first 2 volumes, but the index volume, volume 3, is not reprinted. I have an original set of the 3 volumes, and I will put some of the material from Marco Polo into it as well, so that you can see. You're not aware, but Marco Polo was an extraordinary man. Not only did the Polos go all the way to China and be there, but Marco Polo himself was one of the world's great soldiers of fortune. And he was such a good seaman, not only a ship's captain, but like on the level of an admiral, he was put in charge of the Chinese fleet to get rid of the Indonesian pirates that were stopping the Chinese Navy from commercial shipping going through Indonesia all the way to Africa. And it was Marco Polo who cleared up the Indonesian pirates back in Kublai Khan's time. And for that, he was handsomely rewarded by being given a pass, good anywhere in the world where that power was able to exert itself, which was considerable. And so Marco Polo was able to travel quite freely. He had the wampum belt of the Mongol Khans as being one of the great heroes of that realm. And one of the heroic things that he brought back to Italy was pasta. So you can see that every time we enjoy a little pasta, we are communicating with Marco Polo and taking part in his communion. I want to give you the last two the last couple of hots from the 46th yasna. This leads up to a perilous knife edge that is the equatorial plane of a threshold of challenge. In ancient Zoroastrian, and then later in Zoroastrian lore, it's called the Chinvat Bridge. It is like the bridge of leading into Valhalla. But to go over that bridge is precarious because the bridge constantly narrows until it becomes a razor's edge. Zarathustra wrote 3,934 years ago, "Whoever of mine, man or woman, in Mazda, would give their life to those knowing the best. Asha's Asha, good Kshatra of our mind, and to those inspiring hymns of adoration, but beyond them all, crossing the Chinvat Bridge. Our rulers yoked us, Karpans and Kavis alike, to hideous actions, a life-polluted mankind. In their souls, they themselves chided Dana, even as they are approaching their Chinvat Bridge, where forever false dwelling plummets behind. Since by our Asha, descendant kinfolk of the Turanians, Freyana strong as Armades' earth-sustaining effort, he in good unity accepting mind abides in bliss, Mazda revealing Ahura. These are who Spitama Zarathustra serves. Among those pleased, his renown is upright. So to him is Mazda's life-bestowing Ahura, and his world, the good maturing mind. Him, Asha indeed, regards as her close companion. And so the shared presence is a companion presence that is able to be put into an astrophysical scalar that includes not only all the nations of this planet, but all the planets of all the stars. We belong to a spirit family so massive in its penetration that every time space moves into what was nothingness, it creates the beginnings of light with the trailing of the mysterious cloaks of most of the rest. Thank you for coming.